doors, they've put up the slides, and they've turned on my mic. So I guess that means it's time to go. All right, certainly good to have everybody here tonight. We are, if you will, go ahead and begin opening your Bibles to 2 Corinthians chapter 8. We'll be starting there in just a moment. We do want, however, before we do that, to continue to work on and remember our memory verse for this month, which is Matthew chapter 5 and verse 11, which states, say it with me, "Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake." I guess I was cheating, wasn't I? I was reading off the slide. Shame on me. It's just too easy. All right. I just want to say a comment on that. I think it's been a great deal this year. I think it's great that the elders have put that together. Appreciate Zach and his efforts on that. I think the memory verse roundup of having the kids say it to the older than them people, I'll just say it that way, has been a real blessing. So I think it's been a great deal this year. I've really been encouraged by it. All right, we are going to jump straight into 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on review, in large part because we really are kind of starting a section that's a little different from the rest of the book, as well as we're trying to get through these two chapters tonight, and there's a lot to cover in these two chapters. One of the things that you're going to notice as we look at these two chapters, we've talked a lot up through chapter 7 about Paul defending what? His integrity, and in connection with that, his apostleship or his ministry, his gospel, what he has preached, what he's delivered to these people. When we get to chapters 8 and 9, you're not going to find any of that. There's a completely different change of subject here that begins to take place. And he begins this in chapter 8 verse 1 by saying, "Moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia." And so he's opening up a new subject here. And I just want us to see what is the general subject. If you wanted to say in one or two sentences what chapter 8 and 9 is about, what is the biggest topic? What is it about?
Giving.
Okay, I think he does talk about giving, but I think there's something bigger than that. I think there's something more important than just the giving. Hint, it's on the screen.
He mentions grace 5 times in chapter 8.
Okay, he does mention grace 5 times. Serving. This is a ministry for who? What are they doing in these chapters? Supporting needy saints. So as we look at these two chapters, and he talks about this 3 times here, he mentions it again in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 1, if you turn back over there and look. When he talks about this in the book of Romans, he mentions it another several times. And over again, he talks about the ministering to the saints, the relief for the saints. All of this is about relationship. As we talk about everything else that we talk about in this, we need to remember that Paul is talking about relationships. We can get buried sometimes when we look at chapters like this, or 1 Corinthians chapter 16, and we can get buried in the minutia of the details of giving and the contribution and things related to that. But the overarching concept of what Paul is writing to them about is ministering to the saints. That's the overall concept that he's dealing with here. And as pointed out in chapter 9 and verse 12, the needs of the saints. Now, one of the reasons this is important is when you go back to whoever said he's talking about giving, what is one of the biggest questions that comes up when you start talking about giving? Preacher preaches on giving, somebody talks about giving, what's one of the very first questions that comes up?
How much?
That's one. What's another? What's it used for? Why? Why do I need to give? Our congregation is an overabundant congregation. We've got a nice building. We have all these nice things. We don't have to worry about what we eat. We may have a few people in the congregation who have some physical needs, but overall, we are abundantly blessed. What saints are being referred to that the ministry is for in this context? JD?
Other churches, perhaps?
Other churches, specifically who? Kevin? Stu? Jerusalem. Jerusalem and Judea, the church there, was a famine. There was things going on there, and there was a serious need there. And these people were going to be involved in assisting those brethren. Now, one of the things that we're going to look at, and I don't want to give away the punchline, but we're going to see that this was something they desired to do. They wanted to do. And we're going to talk about that more later. You know, a lot of times when we talk about giving, you know, it's the things we talk about. Well, how much do I have to give? Why do I have to give? We look and we say we're well supplied. If you are not engaged in reading any of the letters from preachers that we support, I strongly encourage you to spend some time reading them. I'm not sure the best way to get a copy of those, to email the preachers and get them, to ask the deacons who handle them and ask for copies. But I suggest you spend some time reading those, if you haven't. Because as soon as you think, hey, we've got everything covered, and the elders here, we talked a couple of weeks ago about how we increased the support for several of the men, and we added some men in support. But I also guarantee you that if you ask the elders, do you ever get other letters about men in need of support? Do these men that write to you suggest either special needs from time to time, or even just their general needs? Hey, you know what? Inflation isn't just hurting people in the United States. And you look at how much they get per month compared to what we do. There is never an end to the need. So before we say anything else about what goes on in the rest of these chapters, this is about supplying the needs of the saints. And as we look at our world today, we have the knowledge of much need among the saints to be addressed. All right. So first of all, we know that in these chapters we're talking about the ministry to the saints. Now the next question that comes up is, why is Paul writing to the Corinthians about this? Why is he spending so much time talking about it? I find it kind of interesting, in fact, that in the first letter he spent just 2 or 3 verses in our Bibles, a paragraph or 2 if you want to put it back in that terminology, talking about this collection. But now he spends an extensive amount of time talking to the Corinthians about this. Let's look at these verses and let's talk about why it is that he did this. At chapter 8 and verse 8, I speak not by commandment, but I am testing the sincerity of your love by the diligence of others. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that you, through his poverty, might become rich. Now notice the statement here. Not by commandment, but testing the sincerity of your love. Look at what follows up in verse 10. And in this I give advice. It is to your advantage not only to be doing what you began and were desiring to do a year ago, but now you must also complete the doing of it. That as there was a readiness to desire it, so there also may be a completion of what you have. For if there is first a willing mind, it is accepted according to what one has, and not according to what he does not have. So what are we seeing so far? And we will continue to see in these verses. What is Paul encouraging them to do? Stephen? Follow through with what they committed to do. He specifically says it's not a commandment. I think we have when we look at giving, we look at the passages about giving, we're going to look a little deeper and a little bit about the Macedonians' attitude in giving. Our attitude shouldn't be, why do I have to? We ought to ask, why shouldn't I want to? Why shouldn't I desire? You go back to the verse we looked at a little bit ago, and he talks about you're motivated by the grace of Jesus Christ. Somebody mentioned a while ago that grace is in this reading 5 times. Here he talks simply about the grace of Jesus Christ. What did Jesus do? Jesus went from being rich to being poor. Why? For our sakes. He gave up everything for us. What better motivation is there to support the work of the Lord and needy saints and understanding that? But the big thing here is these people had already said they wanted to do this. In fact, When was 1 Corinthians written? Does anybody remember date-wise when 1 Corinthians was written? Probably written spring of 57 AD while he was in Ephesus. This letter was most likely written in the summer or fall of 57 AD when he got to Macedonia and began to get these reports of what was going on. Which would mean what about what he wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 16? If we understand that they said they were willing to do it a year ago, the 1 Corinthian letter was written only a few months ago, what does that tell us about 1 Corinthians 16 and the admonition there? It's similar to this admonition, right? It's not about, hey, I'm telling you you have to do this. It's about reminding them, hey, you promised to do something. Make sure you carry through with it. Make sure you follow through on what you said you wanted to do, what you desired to do. We're going to see a little bit more about the impact of that in just a little bit. I really found this verse 11 very interesting. We read through it a moment ago. He says, well, you back up to verse 10, and he says, you were desiring a year ago. Now, how many of us does this sound like? I'm going to raise my hand first because it sounds exactly like me. You desire to do something, but look at what he says. Now you must complete the doing of it. How many times, boy, I really want to do this or that or the other. And a year later, 2 years later, 5 years later, we're still talking about wanting to do it but not getting it done. That's the Corinthians. He said, you've got to complete the desire. And he goes on later in verse 7, as there was a readiness to desire, so also there may be a completion. And he said their willing mind, verse 12, this is also interesting. Their willing mind to do this. What caused the Corinthians to want to do this? Because they could. Not because of what you didn't have, but what you did have. And we'll talk later and we'll see that they evidently had an abundance of wealth. These were evidently people who had some that they could give. And it's in contrast, we'll see, to the Macedonians. And then again in chapter 9 and verse 2, as he continues to talk about this, he says, for I know your willingness, about which I boast of you to the Macedonians, that Achaia was ready a year ago. So again he talks about this. But now watch verse 3. Here's the concern, and here is the why he is spending so much time in this. Yet I have sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain in this respect. That as I said, you may be ready, lest if some Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to mention you, should be ashamed of this confident boasting. So what had happened? What was Paul doing about the Corinthians' willingness and desire? What do we often do when someone encourages us or has a positive attitude? What's one of the first things we do? What do we do with that news? What do we do with that information? Use it as an example. Use it to stir others up. Use it to encourage others. Hey, you know what those Corinthians down there are willing to do? Man, they have been ready for a year. They are excited about giving to this relief effort. Now what happens, Paul says, we show up and there's no money. I don't know that Paul was worried about competition so much as he was worried about embarrassment. People who said, and when you look at when you look at what he says about the Macedonians, which we'll talk about in just a moment, I don't think Paul was trying to force the Macedonians to give. I don't think that was the point at all. I think it was just natural bragging. How many of us, when our kids do something great or accomplish something, what's the first thing we do? We get on Facebook and we tell everybody about it. Not me, I don't do it on Facebook. But anyway, a lot of people get on Facebook or Instagram or somewhere else and they tell everybody, oh, look what this great thing my kid did. Or we go to church and we tell everybody at church, hey, you know what my kid did? You know what happened? Now, we may not be trying to encourage somebody or get somebody else, but a lot of times that's what happens, isn't it? What happens if we come and say, boy, I tell you, my kid this year, they're starting their senior year, and I'm telling you, their heart and mind and soul is set to be valedictorian this year. They're gonna work as hard as they can to do that. And then come the end of the year, it turns out they didn't put forth any effort at all. They end up with kind of a middle-of-the-road grade. I'm not talking about somebody who works as hard as they can and they fall short a little bit. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not when it becomes clear there was no effort put forth. How does that make us look? And Paul was concerned about that. And that's why he's writing to the Corinthians. He's saying, look, you promised something. You told everybody you were willing. You told everybody you were eager. It's not going to look very good if we show up and you're not ready. All right, and then again, we already read verse 4, and then again in verse 5, go on to verse 5. Therefore, I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren to go to you ahead of time and prepare your generous gift beforehand, which you had previously promised, that it may be ready as a matter of generosity and not as grudging obligation. We like to look at that, don't we? Oh, we should give generously, and we're going to talk about some of those verses later. But here, why is he trying to encourage the generosity versus how would it look? They get to Corinth, there's nothing there, and all they're not going, well, let me see what I can find in the bottom of my pocket. I guess I'll give you something now. I guess I have to since I already told you I would. How does that look? So what is the application of that for us? How might that apply to you and I in our giving before we talk about anything else? JD?
Much like, as pointed out, these verses, it has to truly come from a heart that actually wants to give, to actually help someone, even in the smallest way possible. That's how I interpret it.
Okay.
Generosity versus grudge.
Okay. All right. Kyle?
Paul touches on something that's kind of human nature, that when people are not accustomed to giving sacrificially, it seems like a burden. It's difficult. It's a challenge. Sometimes, maybe for a new Christian, it's a new thing. It's a challenge emotionally to let go of something that they've worked hard for and not really understand the reason for it.
Okay.
I think Corinthians understood the reason for it, but they're still challenged with actually following through with what they said. And so the fact that Paul is really focusing attention on the reasons that this is important, that the reflection on the things that God has given, the things that Jesus did, that really our motivation is the fact that God wants us as stewards of these things. He granted all of them to us, and He sacrificed so much for us.
Right. Okay.
Here in verse 5 it says that they previously promised, or Paul said that they had previously promised. In other words, they did what the word is to be yea, yea, or nay, nay. If you make a commitment, fulfill that commitment. Fulfill exactly what you said you was going to do. It's the commitment that they made. And this goes back to chapter 8 and verse 5, where Paul will use the example of the Macedonian brethren and what they committed. They fulfilled what they promised to do.
Right. Okay, very good. Stephen?
It's about faithfulness. I mean, it's about truthfulness, faithfulness, actually carrying out what we commit to do for someone or for a sacrifice that we make. We carry that through, but also realize that it's a shame if we don't. There's actually negative, but we can do more harm by making a commitment and then not fulfilling it than not making the commitment to begin with.
Exactly. Okay, Steve and Stu, and then I'm gonna apply a deal and see if you agree. Kevin?
To your point about, how does that apply to us when we talk about being ready or getting ready? Paul talks about purposing in their heart in verse 7, right? And so to purpose in your heart is to prepare, make ready for something that you're going to do. Giving is worship, just like any other thing that we have commanded to do. And so I think that's a tie in here when he's talking about this. Okay, don't look unorganized or unpurposed, right? So you got a purpose in your heart.
Okay. Stu? Okay. So nobody stole what I was going to say, so you can decide whether you think it's worth anything or not. And I'm not going to ask for a show of hands on this one. But how many times have you either yourself or known of someone who said, okay, I'm going to sit down and make my budget. and I'm going to set aside X number of dollars to give to the Lord. That's going to be my budget to give to the Lord. Now, that's between you and the Lord, but it's something you have said, that's what I'm going to do. But now things get tough. Gas prices go up. Groceries get a little more expensive. And how often is the first thing that we decide I can skimp on or cut back on is the contribution to the Lord? Who's going to know? After all, the church is doing well. We're still supporting a lot of men. If I cut back a little bit, what's that going to hurt? How often do we say, well, you know, maybe I should cut back that extra fast food meal or that extra Starbucks coffee, or I should cut back that extra deal. And instead of going through on our commitments, this is what I'm going to give to the Lord. Maybe we don't tell anybody else, except maybe our spouse or somebody else. But this is what we're going to do. And then we don't fulfill it. Now, in that case, we were probably not facing the embarrassment that the Corinthians were, but I just want us to think about that. When I thought about this, that was something I thought about. Is, are we going back on a promise we made to God about what we were going to do? And do we do it just because it's easy, instead of saying we're going to, as somebody talked about, making sacrificial kind of giving? I'm willing to sacrifice something else to make sure that I can still make my commitment to the Lord. What is our mentality? And so, would Paul need to write to us? It's interesting that there are churches, denominations, at least used to be, I don't know if they still are, but at the first of the year, you had to make your pledges of how much you were going to give that year. And the church would hold you accountable if you didn't.
To that point, there's a word that's not being used, and maybe it is to be used here. That which you vowed, or you promised, or you committed, or you pledged. The Old Testament, we talked about lessons from fulfilling what you vowed. Do that in our vows to our spouses, our vows and our commitments that we make in other relationships. And the first one is our vow to be faithful to God, back to Stephen's comment.
Right. Very good. All good comments. Appreciate it. Let's move on to the next concept. Let's talk about the attitudes that are involved. Well, first of all, let's look at the Macedonians, because I think they're an interesting case study. And it's interesting what motivated the Macedonians in the first place. I've already talked about it a little bit. The commitment of the Corinthians, right? The boasting that Paul had done about the Corinthians. Man, these Corinthians, man, they are just so excited to give to the relief work down there. They promised way back that they wanted to be a part of this, and we are excited to see what they're going to do. So now let's look at the Macedonians. Let's go back to chapter 8. In verse 2, that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality. For I bear witness that according to their ability, yes, and beyond their ability. Now, is there any story that Jesus, in the life of Jesus, this might make you think about? Which one? The widow and the two mites. You know, here are the Corinthians, and they're pictured as being wealthy, and they have a lot to they have a lot to give. Can't get them to put their stuff together. But here are the Macedonians. And they're evidently not a rich people. But not only are they wanting to give, they are begging to give. Not just, hey, let me give you 50 cents so I can just say I participated. You know, when I have had conversations with people about sponsoring churches and orphans' homes and things like that, one of the things that makes people feel really good is, you know what, I go to church on Sunday and I put my little bit in the collection plate, and I have done my part for the orphans. I have done my part for the old people. I have done my part for all those people. Now, I wouldn't, adopt one, and I wouldn't show any care for one, and I wouldn't go and help an old person, and I wouldn't, have any act of service. But you know what, I've done my part. I put my little bit in the plate, and I've let the church take care of it, and man, now I feel good. But here are the Macedonians who are saying, look, there's people down there, they're in need, and we may not have much. We want to give you everything that we can, and then some. And so he goes on to say, verse 4, beyond their ability, they were freely willing, into verse 3, imploring us with much urgency that we would receive the gift, and here's the key now, and the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. Why were the Macedonians so interested in being a part of this? Because they wanted to help their brethren. They wanted to help somebody else who had a common faith. And I go back again to reading these letters from these preachers, and you see what they endure and the things that they go through. And if it doesn't stir a desire to want to help, I can't help you. You know, I sit and I drive around in a car that's probably less than 3 years old. It seats 8 people. It rides like a dream. It has air conditioning. It has heat in the winter. It holds a ton of stuff when I need to haul stuff. And then I go and read about a preacher in the Philippines that rides a 3-wheeled motorcycle. Whether it's raining, whatever's going on, that's how he gets from church to church to preach the gospel. They were begging. They were imploring. Now read the rest of verse 5. And not only as we had hoped, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and then to us by the will of God. What is the foundation of the Macedonians' attitude? Several people have already talked about it. Their faithfulness to the Lord, their desire to be a part of the Lord and a part of the work with Paul. They wanted to be a part because it would get their name on a brick in some building that said donated by. Because their name would end up on the side of a building that says in honor of or in memory of. No, I don't know any of the names of the brethren in Macedonia. As far as I know, their name's not on a brick anywhere in Jerusalem that said, hey, we got so much money from this guy. Isn't that great? They did it because they wanted to be a part of the work of God. They first gave themselves to the Lord. And if we're struggling in our giving, maybe the very first thing we need to look at is, what is our relationship with God? Is He really what's our most important consideration in our lives? And secondly, what is our attitude toward our brethren? And especially those of our brethren who might be in need. Now let's look at the contrast. What is, maybe not the contrast, but what Paul is trying, the attitude that Paul is trying to get out of the Corinthians. So he's got the Macedonians over here, and he can't get them to quit giving. He can't make them stop. And he's got the Corinthians over here that have been promising to give, but they're not giving. What does he say to them? In verse 7 he says, but as you abound in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, and in all diligence, and in your love for us, do what? See that you abound in this grace also. He says, look, and I'm going to tell you, there's some things that he commends them for, that if you read 1st and 2nd Corinthians, you go, is he still talking about the Corinthians? Because they abound in knowledge, and they abound in speech, and they abound in diligence. And he says all these positive things, but now what you need to do is also abound in this. And again, it's been pointed out, talking about the grace. Grace has been bestowed to them. You bestow that grace back. Abound in this grace. And I think it is so important. We get caught up, and we talked about it at the very beginning. What do we ask when we talk about giving? What are the first things we talk about? Well, how much, and do I have to? Or why do I need to? And Paul has all of that answered. Doesn't tell you how much, but he tells you the attitude, and that's the most important thing. If you've got the right attitude, you're going to do the right thing where your giving is concerned. And that's what he's trying to get them to see. Go on into verse 8. Read this earlier. I speak not by commandment, but I am testing the sincerity of your love by the diligence of others. What did John say about loving? Love not in word, but in deed. James said, prove your faith by your works. I can stand here all day and say, I love my brethren, I love God, I am faithful to God, and then go out and live a life that proves everything I said is false. Brethren in Corinth evidently said, we love those brethren down there. And it was particularly interesting because they're Gentiles giving to Jews. Is that a common relationship in this day and age? In that day and age? That's not a common relationship. Jews and Gentiles they didn't get along. And yet here are Gentiles saying, we love a bunch of Jews down there in Jerusalem and we want to help them out. Why? Because we love them for their faith. He says, now prove that. We're going to test the sincerity of your love. Is it the same for us? Come down to verse 10. In this I give advice, it's your advantage to only be doing what you began a year ago, but we're desiring to do. Talked about this a little bit earlier. What is our attitude in giving? Is it I have to give, or is it I desire to give? I desire to be a part of this. I want to be a part of this. Verse 12, we've already talked about a little bit. Willing mind. For if there is first a willing mind, they were willing to do this. Said they were. Ask some of these people who are having Bible studies. They sent out an email earlier this week talking about all the Bible studies that we're having. But ask some of these people who are involved in Bible studies, how many times have you said to somebody, would you like to study the Bible? Oh yeah, I'm willing to study the Bible. And then the time came to sit down and study the Bible. And every time you had something set up, oh, I'm sorry, I got a conflict. Oh, I got to change that. And eventually they just say, I'm not going to. So I'm willing to study the Bible until it comes down to actually doing it. Well, I'm willing to give to the Lord. I'm willing to make those sacrifices. Well, until it comes time to actually doing it. And that was the challenge. And he's challenging them. You had a willing mind. You come to chapter 9 and verse 2, and you see a similar concept. For I know your willingness. In fact, it's interesting that in verse 1 he says, it is superfluous. That's a big old word. What does superfluous mean? Unnecessary. It's over the top. I shouldn't even have to be writing to you about this. Why? Why shouldn't I? For I know your willingness, about which I boast of you to the Macedonians, that Achaia was ready a year ago, and your zeal has stirred up the majority. You lit other people on fire. You were so willing to do the right thing, you lit other people on fire. But now your spark has gone out. You haven't done what you said you would do. In verse 5, we talked about this a little bit earlier, that it may be as a matter of generosity and not as... Does anybody have a different translation at the end of verse 5 other than grudging obligation? Covetousness. Now what happens when we say, you know what, if I'm not willing to give what I said I was going to give, I'm not going to have the zeal that I was going to give, it's one thing to say, well, I just kind of slacked off a little bit. What if we now say you're guilty of covetousness because you're not willing to give God what you said you would? Does that hurt a little more? Make us think twice a little more? That's really what Paul said, that you give out of generosity because you want to, because you're willing, because you're full of zeal, not out of covetousness.
You bring that up, it brought to my mind that one of the things that Paul specifically mentioned back in the first letter in chapter 5, when he's talking about not keeping company with those among brethren that are in sin, he named a few particular sins, and one of them was covetousness. That's a danger that sometimes I don't think we take seriously enough. Paul takes so seriously that he said we really should, when we're disciplining someone that's in sin, covetousness is among those things that is deserving of that sort of attention.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's one of those things, I have a lesson I preach sometimes called acceptable sins. And the point of it is we all agree murder's wrong, and we all agree that adultery's wrong. But you know what? A little bit of anger is okay, and a little bit of covetousness is okay. If we want to be a little bit greedy, and we want to be a little bit angry now, we're okay with that. And we put up with some of those things. And we're going to stand against those big things. Sometimes we, as Kyle just pointed out, we don't make enough effort to point out covetousness and some of these other things that the Bible calls out and says, these are sins. You're guilty of these. You're not going to heaven. You're not going to make it. You've got to address these things. All right? In chapter 9 and verse 6, now notice that I put this under attitude because it is. This I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. He who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. What do televangelists do with this passage and other passages in the New Testament? The more you give, the more money you give me, the more you're going to get back from God. You just give me a bunch, and I promise you God's going to give you a bunch. That is not what he's talking about here. The word bountifully here is not about amount, it's about attitude. Do we give it with grace? Do we give it with an attitude of blessing? It goes back to everything that we've already talked about. And what he just talked about a couple of verses before, or the verse before. Am I doing it because I'm doing it grudgingly or because I'm giving it as a blessing and I am so happy to be a part of it and I want to do it? It's the attitude with which we give. Paul, in all of this, he's not telling them here, I want you to give this dollar amount, using our terminology today. He's saying, I want you to fulfill your promises and I want you to have the right attitude. Do I see a hand over here? Okay, maybe not. And if somebody over here raised your hand and I missed you, I'm sorry, because I just realized I have hardly looked over here, so if I missed you, I apologize. All right, verse 7. We all know this one, don't we? Kevin talked about it a little bit a while ago. Let each one give us as he purposes in his heart. And again, interestingly, what is it contrasted with? Not grudgingly or of necessity. I make a plan. I make a purpose. I make a promise. This is what I'm going to do. And with that, as Kyle pointed out, might come some sacrifices. It might take giving up something else so that I can fulfill that purpose and that promise. And if you ask anybody who's ever tried to lose weight, making a purpose and getting to the end of it can be a challenge. I tell people I am always committed to my diet when I'm asleep. When I wake up, it gets a whole lot harder. Or until I sit down at the table and there's a whole bunch of good food on the table. Or I drive by a Krispy Kreme and the hot donut light is flashing. I'm going to diet. I'm going to cut down my calories. I'm going to cut down my carbs. Well, just how many times do we do that with our stuff with the Lord? Well, I'm going to purpose until, it gets a little harder. Verse 7, further in this verse, same idea. For God loves a cheerful giver. Doesn't mean we just smile when we put the money in the box or in the plate. It means that we truly have an attitude that says, I'm glad to do this. It should apply to all of our worship. Kevin mentioned earlier, this is part of our worship. It declares what we think God is worth, what we think our brethren are worth. Think about how it would apply to our other aspects of worship. Think about how our children would see. If our children see us get up in the morning on Sunday and it's like, man, gotta go to church again. Man, I really don't want to. I don't want to go sit in that church building for another 2.5 hours. But if I don't, the elders are going to be calling me, or the deacons are going to be calling me, or somebody will be calling me. I guess I better get up and get over there. Well, how is it if we do the same with the way we give? And then finally, the word liberally. And in verse 11, and this does, again, apply to attitude. You are enriched in everything for all liberality, which causes thanksgiving through us to God. So, Paul is looking for an attitude. He's looking for a commitment to what they had promised, and he's looking for an attitude. I only have 4 minutes left. Okay, well, I am on my last slide, so I guess we're all right. So what is the desired outcome? What is Paul striving for? This would be when I was younger and I was working with different people who were teaching me how to preach. One of the things we say, what's the point of your lesson? What are you trying to get people to understand when you're done? And I guess that's what we're talking about here. What are we hoping to accomplish? What did Paul want to accomplish by getting them to have the right attitude, by completing their promises? And we see these various things throughout these two chapters. Chapter 8 and verse 6. So we urge Titus that as he had begun, so he would also complete this grace in you as well. He wanted them to complete what they had promised. We see that again in verse 11. We talked about this earlier. That was one of the things he wanted to accomplish. Verse 13, here is one of the clear issues. For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened. You know, there are some people who say, well, you know what? Christianity teaches communism. Everybody just gives and everybody's poor and you just put all in one big pot and everybody shares equally. Paul says, I'm not talking about you being put in a position of being burdened. That's what I'm saying. Look at what he goes on to say. I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but by an equality, that now at this time your abundance may supply their lack, that their abundance also may supply your lack, that there may be equality. As it is written, he who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. He says, look, right now, there's a situation where you have abundance and they have lack. You may be lacking in some things that they can fulfill spiritually or otherwise. And you can help each other out. It's a symbiotic relationship. But you've got something in abundance that they need right now, and you can help them. Chapter 9 and verse 5. Therefore, I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren to go ahead of you in time and prepare your generous gift beforehand, that you had previously promised, that it may be ready as a matter of generosity. He wanted their gift to be ready. Coming down to verse 11, he talks about the all liberality, which gives thanksgiving through us to God. So what happens when these Corinthians do what they ought to do? God is glorified. Thanksgiving is offered for what they're willing to do, and so forth. For the administration of this service not only supplies the needs of the saints, but is also abounding through many thanksgivings to God, while through the proof of this ministry they glorify God for the obedience of your confession to the gospel of Christ and for your liberal sharing with them and all. You notice I did not say the word men. If you're reading New King James, some other translations, the word men exists there. If you're reading from the New King James, the New American Standard, you'll notice that word is in italics. Anybody know what that means when you see that in one of the older translations? It's inserted by the translator. Didn't originally exist there. They filled what they thought the rest of the thought was. That may not necessarily be a good translation. ESV says, and others, which leaves it a lot more open to understanding what he may be talking about here. You're sharing with them in their money, and with all, or with others, in their faith, and the benefit that it brings. We talked about this earlier. What does it do when the Gentiles are willing to share with Jews? It brings glory to God. Just to the ones who receive the gift? No. But to maybe other Christians, and maybe to others who aren't Christians, who say, hey, there's something special going on in that relationship. All right, my time is up, and I will let Ben answer any other questions that you might have next week.